Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you just stumbled in while scrolling through YouTube at a truly unreasonable hour. If you're here, you probably couldn't sleep, and that's okay. Tonight, we're going to drift into one of those historical rabbit holes that's, well, a little strange, a little uncomfortable, and somehow still oddly relaxing when you just let the details wash over. Eunuchs. Yeah, not the most glamorous job description in the ancient world. Imagine being remembered in history, not as a king, or a warrior, or even just a baker with good bread, but as the eunuch. That was your whole brand. Now, before we go too far, let me just set the mood. Get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, take a sip of water or tea if you're fancy. This is not going to be fast-paced, or exciting, or filled with dramatic reveals. No, this is bedtime history. Tonight, we're taking the scenic route, because eunuchs are one of those strange institutions that cropped up in empires all over the world. The Romans, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, the Chinese, they all had their own variations. And across these cultures, eunuchs managed to be both utterly marginalized and somehow absurdly powerful at the same time. A paradox wrapped in silk robes, often with access to the royal treasury. And, just to be clear, in case anyone out there was hoping for a technical lecture, don't worry. We are not going into surgical detail. This is a sleepy corner of history, not a medical textbook. We're just going to glide over that part with a soft focus lens of yes, that happened. Alright, so let's ease into it. The word eunuch comes from the Greek eunuchos, which literally means bedkeeper. And no, that doesn't mean they were professional mattress testers. It meant that these men were often put in charge of guarding the women of the palace wives, concubines, daughters basically. Anyone who the ruler wanted to keep under lock and key. And of course, rulers didn't want their trusted guardians accidentally fathering any surprise heirs. So, problem solved. But here's the funny twist. Once you've removed that, let's call it risk factor, eunuchs became incredibly useful in other ways too. They were considered loyal, because they couldn't start their own dynasties. They couldn't pass power to sons, so they were less threatening to kings and emperors, which meant they were often handed extremely sensitive jobs. Running treasuries, managing secret documents, whispering in the royal ear at midnight. It's ironic, isn't it? The very thing that marked them as incomplete in the eyes of society is what made them indispensable in politics. Let's float gently over to ancient China. The Chinese imperial court, especially under the Ming dynasty, had hundreds of eunuchs. Some were lowly servants, cleaning floors or tending gardens. Others became titans of the bureaucracy. And then you had people like Zheng He. If you've never heard of him, imagine a man who was technically a eunuch, technically a servant, and also somehow the admiral of the largest naval expeditions of the 15th century. He sailed massive treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean, dropping in on kingdoms from Sri Lanka to East Africa, casually spreading Chinese influence like it was a vacation brochure. So, yes, eunuch, and also global explorer, because history loves a good contradiction. And what's even stranger is how they were both feared and resented. Scholars, especially Confucian bureaucrats, often hated eunuchs. They were seen as corrupt, meddling, untrustworthy. But emperors, they loved them, because nothing says loyalty quite like a servant who literally cannot produce an heir to rival your own. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, eunuchs had their own niche. The Byzantines were obsessed with hierarchy, titles, ranks, who sat where at dinner. It was all mapped out in excruciating detail. And eunuchs, they occupied this weird in-between space. Not quite men, not quite women, socially speaking, which meant they were sometimes used as political wildcards. They could serve as advisors, generals, even church officials. There was even a eunuch who became Patriarch of Constantinople, basically the top religious leader, because apparently, the logic was, if he can't be tempted by women, maybe he'll be holier. Spoiler. That's not really how it worked, but it was the theory. And the Byzantines, ever poetic, sometimes described eunuchs as angelic, because angels were also seen as sexless, which is a very flattering spin on a very grim reality. Let's float westward now, to the Ottoman Empire. If you've ever seen those dramatic paintings of the Topkapi Palace harem with flowing robes, silken cushions, and way too much incense, the people keeping that entire system running were eunuchs. The Ottoman court had two main groups, the black eunuchs, who mostly guarded the harem itself, and the white eunuchs, who handled administrative duties and trained pages for palace service, and the chief black eunuch. He was one of the most powerful figures in the empire. He had direct access to the sultan's household, influence over the sultan's mother, the valid sultan, and often mediated between the palace and the outside world. Imagine being technically a slave, but also one of the few people who could decide who got an audience with the emperor. That's the strange paradox of eunuchs in power. Now, you might be wondering, what were their personal lives like? And the answer is complicated. Some eunuchs lived in luxury, silk robes, servants of their own, feasts in palaces. Others lived quietly, serving in temples or households with little recognition. Many were slaves, taken as children and altered before they had any say in the matter. And across the board, their identities were shaped by this strange social limbo. They weren't quite part of the male elite. They weren't part of the female world either. They existed in a third category, one that carried both stigma and opportunity. They were mocked, pitied, envied, and relied upon, sometimes all in the same day. It's almost like being stuck forever as the middle child of society, not fully trusted, not fully dismissed, just there. Let's pause and consider something a little more mundane. Imagine being a eunuch in a small provincial palace. You're not an admiral, or a political mastermind, or a grand vizier. You're just the guy keeping track of linens, or organizing who gets to enter the harem courtyard, or delivering messages. Day in, day out, a life of service. Your meals are basic, your bed is simple, but compared to the average peasant farmer, you're living in relative comfort. And yet, every time you walk through the marketplace, you hear whispers. People look, and they know. You're marked, socially, forever. That's the quieter side of their lives, the long, anonymous service of thousands who never made it into the history books. Now, I don't want to make this sound too dramatic. Remember, we're in sleepy history mode. This isn't Game of Thrones. No sudden betrayals or shocking plot twists. Just the slow, steady reality that for centuries, eunuchs were a fact of life in imperial systems. They were administrators, diplomats, gatekeepers, caretakers of harems and palaces. Sometimes powerful, sometimes forgotten, always a little outside the norm. And what makes them fascinating, at least to me, is this strange mix of tragedy and practicality. On the one hand, their lives began with an act of violence. On the other hand, some of them ended up wielding influence that ordinary men could only dream of. History, as usual, is messy like that. Alright, that's enough drifting for now. We've set the stage. We've seen eunuchs in China, Byzantium, and the Ottoman court. We've touched on their paradoxical role as both marginalized and powerful. In the next stretch, we'll float more slowly through individual stories. We'll meet a few of the most famous eunuchs, peek into their daily routines, and explore how they managed to shape empires from behind the palace curtains. So take a breath, adjust your blanket. Let's keep gliding through the quiet corridors of history together. Hey again, still awake, maybe half asleep. That's fine, either way, we're just floating along tonight. No rush. In part 1 we set the stage, what eunuchs were, how they existed in this strange middle space between power and marginalization. Tonight, let's slip a little deeper. Let's walk softly through the palace's peak around the silk curtains, and meet some of the actual figures who made history. Not as kings, not as generals in shining armor, but as the quiet men who held the keys to the royal chambers. Because, honestly, some of the most famous eunuchs managed to do more with their reduced lives than entire dynasties did, with crowns and armies. Which, if you think about it, is kind of funny. History is full of emperors who thought they were the center of the world, but who actually controlled access to their bedchambers. The eunuchs standing by the door. Let's start where we left off with China. The Ming dynasty is one of those periods where eunuchs were everywhere. Some historians estimate there were as many as 70,000 of them in service at one time. 70,000. Imagine an entire city made up of palace eunuchs. Some were scrubbing kitchens, some were polishing jade ornaments, some were keeping ledgers of rice shipments, and just a few were running naval expeditions that stretched across half the globe. That brings us back to Zhang He. Zhang He is one of those historical figures that makes you stop and blink. Born in Yunnan province in the late 14th century, he started life with a completely different name. He was a Muslim boy from a Mongol family, and, well, let's just say he didn't choose his future career. After his family was captured during Ming consolidation campaigns, Young Ma, he was castrated and sent into imperial service. Not the brightest childhood, but somehow, this boy rose. He became a close servant to the prince, who would later be the Yongle emperor. And when Yongle needed someone he could trust to command his massive treasure fleets, he didn't pick a nobleman. He picked Zheng He, the eunuch. So there he was, leading giant ships far larger than anything Columbus would sail decades later down the coasts of India, to the Spice Islands, across to East Africa. Picture a eunuch in silk robes, standing on the deck of a ship the size of a small football field, calmly directing a fleet of hundreds. He brought back giraffes for the emperor, exotic animals, envoys from distant kingdoms, all while technically holding the title of palace servant. There's a strange poetry in that. He was both a symbol of imperial power and a reminder of personal loss. His voyages showed the world how wealthy and advanced Ming China was. But behind that grandeur was a man who'd been reshaped by force, carrying his scars into the salt air. And when he died, he was remembered not just as a eunuch, but as one of the greatest explorers in Chinese history, which is probably not how his captors imagined his life would turn out. Let's drift westward now, over to Byzantium. Byzantium loved its eunuchs, not necessarily in a warm and fuzzy way, but in the we can use them for everything way. They filled court offices, church ranks, and even led armies. One of the most famous examples, Narses. Now, Narses wasn't your typical general. He was born in Armenia around the year 478. He entered the service of the Eastern Roman court, as you guessed it, a eunuch. He spent much of his early life not in armor, but in silks, managing palace ceremonies and finances. He was already over 50 years old before he ever commanded troops, which, in ancient warfare, was basically retirement age, and yet, he became one of Byzantium's greatest commanders. When Justinian needed someone to finally finish off the Gothic wars in Italy, a long, messy conflict dragging the empire down, he sent Narses, this court eunuch, who had never been a career soldier, marched into Italy at the age of 70, and decisively crushed the Goths at the Battle of Togone in 552. Imagine your grandpa leading an army across the Apennines and somehow winning. That was Narses, of course. He wasn't remembered as some dashing hero. Byzantine chroniclers were a little awkward about it. A eunuch general didn't quite fit their ideal. So instead of lauding his virility or courage, they praised his cunning, his patience, his ability to control men without, being fully one of them, which is a polite Byzantine way of saying he got results, even if he wasn't a real man. Still, Narses carved his name into history. Proof that in Byzantium, being a eunuch didn't stop you from rewriting the map of Italy. Now, if you're still with me, let's slide down into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans took eunuchs to an art form. Their entire palace system ran on them, and none were more infamous than the Kisla Acosta, chief black eunuch. This man controlled the harem, which, to be clear, wasn't just some sensual fantasyland of belly dancers like European painters liked to imagine. The harem was the political heart of the empire. It was where the sultan's wives, concubines, sisters, and most importantly his mother lived. And the chief black eunuch controlled who went in, who went out, and which messages reached the women who could sway the sultan himself. Think of him as the gatekeeper, not only to the harem, but to the empire's inner politics. He could make or break careers with a word, and the men who held this position weren't faceless bureaucrats. They were celebrities in their own right. One of the most famous was Habashi Memduga in the 17th century, who became enormously wealthy. Others were deeply feared. They had no dynasties, but they built fortunes, networks, and influence that stretched across the Ottoman world. And yet, like everywhere else, they lived in contradiction, revered inside the palace, mocked or despised outside it, always walking that thin line between intimacy and exclusion. But let's take a step back for a moment. We've named a few great eunuchs: Zheng He, Narses, the Ottoman chief, guardians. Those are the flashy stories. Most eunuchs, they weren't explorers or generals or imperial gatekeepers. They lived quieter lives. Imagine a Byzantine eunuch cleric, spending his life in the soft candlelight of Hagia Sophia. He chants prayers, tends the altar, copies manuscripts. People respect him, but whisper behind his back. Or picture a nameless eunuch in the Ottoman kitchens, directing the preparation of endless banquets. He tastes dishes to ensure nothing is poisoned. He never leaves the palace grounds. His whole world is marble corridors, tiled courtyards, the smell of roasting lamb, and the soft hush of water in fountains. Or in Ming China, a low-ranking eunuch sweeping courtyards, carrying lacquer trays, recording rice shipments. He lives in the forbidden city his entire life, yet never sees the outside world again. A servant whose name is lost, but whose daily labor kept the imperial machine humming. Thousands of lives like that, hidden, forgotten, but essential. So what did their daily routines actually look like? Well, in general, eunuchs lived very structured lives. They rose early, worked long hours, and were bound by strict palace regulations. Their clothing often marked them out different colors, simpler cuts. They weren't mistaken for nobles, but they weren't peasants either. Somewhere in between. Meals were modest, unless you were in the upper ranks. The higher you climbed, the more luxuries you enjoyed. Some lived in relative poverty. Others accumulated wealth that could rival small princes. And always, they walked a fine line. Too much ambition could backfire. Too much humility meant you were forgotten. Success often depended on subtlety, knowing when to step forward, when to bow back. Which, to be fair, is kind of the perfect training for a sleepy YouTube video, since their whole lives were about mastering calm, quiet, understated presence. Alright, that's enough wandering for now. We've met Zheng He, who turned forced servitude into world-spanning voyages. We've seen Narses, the elderly Byzantine eunuch, who somehow conquered Italy, and we've peeked into the Ottoman palace, where the chief black eunuchs turned a position of supposed weakness into one of the most powerful offices in the empire. But of course, that's only scratching the surface. Eunuchs didn't just serve rulers, they often outlived them. Dynasties rose and fell, emperors came and went, and the eunuchs kept their posts, which gave them an eerie sort of continuity in societies obsessed with succession. So, in the next stretch, let's drift further into their long-term influence. We'll talk about how eunuchs became scapegoats for corruption, why scholars despised them, and how they symbolized both stability and decay in the courts they served. For now, though, breathe easy. Adjust your pillow. We're just gliding slowly through quiet halls and half-forgotten corridors of power. Hey, you're still here. Or maybe you've dozed off with one earbud in, which is kind of the point. Either way, we'll keep going, smooth and unhurried. So far we've met some of the success stories, the Zheng He types, the Narses types, men who rose against the odds, who became explorers, generals, kingmakers. But here's the thing, for every celebrated eunuch in history, there were hundreds, if not thousands, who ended up carrying the blame for everything wrong in their empires. Because apparently, if your dynasty is collapsing, if your treasury is empty, if your emperor is incompetent, obviously, it's the eunuch's fault. It became a kind of historical reflex. Empire crumbling. Blame the eunuch. Let's float through a few examples. First, let's return to China. If you pick up almost any history of a Chinese dynasty in its final decline, chances are the eunuchs are listed as villains. The Han, the Tang, the Mingul have stories of greedy eunuchs who corrupted the emperor, monopolized power, and strangled honest governance. Take the late Han dynasty. The so-called 10 attendants. These were high-ranking eunuchs serving at court during the 2nd century. They were accused of selling offices, manipulating the young emperors, and hoarding wealth. At one point, one of them supposedly owned so much land and property that he was basically a miniature warlord. Were they actually that bad? It's hard to say. The official histories, written by Confucian scholars, were not exactly unbiased. Scholar officials hated eunuchs, partly because eunuchs bypassed the normal civil service exam system. There were outsiders who could whisper in the emperor's ear without having to memorize 400 volumes of Confucian classics. For career bureaucrats, that was infuriating. So of course the eunuchs had to be portrayed as villains. But in fairness, some did get a little excessive. They knew the emperor relied on them. They could control palace access. They could sell favors. And, human nature being what it is, many of them did. The 10 attendants ended up so resented that they were massacred in 189 CE during a palace coup. Thousands of other eunuchs were killed along with them. It didn't actually save the dynasty. The Han collapsed anyway, but hey, the bureaucrats got their revenge. So in the Confucian worldview, eunuchs were basically like mold. They crept into the cracks of government whenever a dynasty got damp and weak. Now let's drift over to Byzantium again. Byzantine writers had a love-hate relationship with eunuchs. On the one hand, they couldn't run the empire without them. Eunuchs were indispensable administrators. On the other hand, when things went wrong, they were convenient scapegoats. Take the 9th and 10th centuries. Court histories are full of lines like, "The eunuchs corrupted the emperor," or "The eunuch squandered the treasury," which usually translated into "The bureaucrat made decisions the chronicler didn't like." And then there's the simple fact that eunuchs didn't fit neatly into the Byzantine idea of masculinity. Byzantine culture valued the warrior ideal. A real man fought on horseback, commanded armies, fathered heirs. Eunuchs, by definition, couldn't do the last one, and often weren't expected to do the first two. So when they rose to high in power, they looked suspicious, unnatural. There's a chronicler named Liutprand of Cremonahie was a Western ambassador visiting Constantinople in the 10th century. He couldn't stop sneering about how many eunuchs there were. To him, the entire Byzantine court looked effeminate, corrupt, overscented, which says more about Liutprand's Western warrior biases than it does about Byzantium itself. But it gives you a sense of how eunuchs symbolized, in the medieval imagination, a soft, decadent empire. Ironically, that didn't stop emperors from trusting them. Even emperors who publicly railed against corrupt eunuchs still relied on their most loyal ones. So again, contradiction. And then we have the Ottomans. The Ottomans perfected the dual role of eunuchs as both trusted guardians and easy scapegoats. When things went well, the chief black eunuch was indispensable. When things went badly, he was an obvious villain. In the 17th century, as the empire began to stumble, militarily defeats, financial troubles, rebellious provinces, pamphlets started circulating in Istanbul, blaming everything on palace corruption. Who was at the center of that corruption? The eunuchs, especially the harem eunuchs. Writers claimed they meddled in politics, diverted funds, whispered in the sultan's ear, and basically undermined the empire from within. One chief, eunuch Bashir Ugga, became infamous for his wealth. He owned estates, ran vast waqf charities, and controlled appointments in both palace and mosque. To his allies, he was a wise patron. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of corruption. And again, it's hard not to notice the pattern. People resented eunuchs, not just for their supposed greed, but because they were powerful outsiders. They had no dynasties, no families, no heirs. They were, in a sense, unmoored individuals who wielded institutional power without fitting into society's family-centered norms. For many contemporaries, that felt threatening. So let's pause and notice the irony here. Eunuchs were indispensable. They were the only people rulers trusted completely in private. They guarded the treasury. They managed secret correspondence. They trained imperial children. And yet, when history was written, they often ended up as villains. Part of that is human psychology. It's easier to blame a faceless corrupt group than admit your emperor just wasn't very good at his job. The dynasty fell because the eunuchs ruined everything. Sounds much tidier than the emperor gambled away resources and lost a war. Part of it, too, was cultural discomfort. Eunuchs blurred categories. They weren't men, they weren't women. They couldn't marry, couldn't father heirs. In societies obsessed with lineage, that made them feel alien. And alien groups are always easy scapegoats. So whether in Han China, in Constantinople, or in Istanbul, the pattern repeats. Eunuchs rise, wield power, and then get blamed when the whole system creaks under its own weight. And what about their actual personalities? Well, here's the sleepy truth. Most were probably just normal, petty, ambitious, maybe corrupt, maybe loyal, a few brilliant, a few terrible, the rest just middled along. But chroniclers rarely recorded that. They exaggerated. A eunuch was either a paragon of loyalty or a scheming parasite, rarely in between, which is how Zangi becomes a legend, while the 10 attendants become villains, and everyone else disappears into silence. Let's zoom out for a second. There's something oddly poignant about this cycle. Eunuchs were made powerless as individuals. Their bodies were altered. Their family lines ended with them. And yet, through service, they often wielded immense institutional power. They were both powerless and powerful, central and marginal, revered and hated. That contradiction haunted how they were remembered, which is why, even today, if you read histories of ancient empires, eunuchs pop up as little symbols. They're like the weather vanes of court politics. When things were sunny, they were loyal guardians. When storms blew in, they were the dark clouds. So, let's take a breath here. Adjust your blanket, maybe sip some water. We've wandered through a lot of slow corridors tonight. We've seen eunuchs as explorers, generals, guardians, and now, as villains of decline, always necessary, always distrusted. In our next stretch, we'll turn even softer. We'll look at their personal lives, their friendships, their patronage of art and religion, and the quieter human side that slips through the official histories. Because behind every scheming eunuch stereotype was, well, an actual person. And that's where we'll drift next. Hey, again, if you're still with me, you're officially in the deep end of the sleepy history pool. If you're already half asleep, don't worry, this next stretch is all about the softer, quieter parts of eunuch life. Less palace intrigue, more the subtle, human details. We've seen them blamed for dynastic collapse, painted as villains, or turned into symbols of corruption. But here's the thing, most eunuchs weren't masterminds behind the throne. They weren't Zheng He, or Narses, or some notorious chief eunuch hoarding estates. Most were just there, living inside palaces, serving, following routines, invisible cogs in the massive machinery of empire. And yet, if you listen closely, you can hear little echoes of their daily lives. Let's start in Byzantium, because Byzantine writers were especially fascinated by the in-between nature of eunuchs. A eunuch at the imperial palace might begin his day in quiet routines. They woke before dawn, like monks, because the palace never really slept. There were morning prayers, early meetings, rituals of clothing the emperor, preparing the throne room, a whole choreography of ceremony. Eunuchs often lived in palace quarters, close, but not too close, always present, yet never quite fully part of the royal family. They were like the wallpaper of imperial life scene, but rarely noticed. Some found solace in religion. Many eunuchs became patrons of monasteries. They paid for churches, funded manuscripts, donated relics. Why? Maybe to earn favor with heaven, or maybe because they knew they would leave no heirs, and charity was their way of leaving a mark. And it worked. Their names show up in foundation charters, etched into stone inscriptions, tucked into the margins of old codices, little breadcrumbs of remembrance. One Byzantine eunuch, Basil Lekapin, became so wealthy that he basically ran his own monastery industrial complex. He poured money into churches, funded clerics, and set himself up as a holy patron. Even centuries later, his name lingered in prayer books. Not bad for someone technically barred from family legacy. Over in China, eunuchs also turned to patronage. Since they had no heirs to inherit estates, many donated money to temples or public works. Some paid for bridges, others for Buddhist monasteries. Ironically, while historians painted them as selfish, a lot of infrastructure projects came from eunuch patronage. You could argue they left behind more tangible public works than some emperors did. And then, there's the arts. Court eunuchs often sponsored opera troupes, painters, and calligraphers. Imagine them, after long days in court, quietly attending a performance of shadow puppets, or listening to a new musical piece. Small comforts in otherwise constrained lives. And yes, let's talk about relationships, because eunuchs weren't robots. It's easy to imagine them as detached figures, but of course they formed bonds, friendships, rivalries, maybe even romances, though the sources get cagey on that part. In Byzantium, eunuchs were often described as favorites of the emperor. That word favorite could mean many things. Sometimes it just meant trusted servant. Sometimes it meant constant companion. And sometimes, well, it hinted at something more personal. Court gossip being what it is, those rumors were probably exaggerated half the time. But the fact that they existed at all tells us people noticed closeness. In the Ottoman palace, the chief black eunuch sometimes acted almost like an adopted father to young princes. Since biological fathers, the sultans, were distant and busy. It was the eunuchs who raised the boys, taught them manners, arranged their routines. Imagine being a 6-year-old prince and realizing the most constant figure in your life wasn't he your dad, or even your mother, but a eunuch who tucked you into bed and scolded you for not memorizing your Quran lessons. That's a kind of intimacy that doesn't get recorded in official chronicles, but it shaped generations of rulers. And what about loneliness? That's the harder question, because eunuchs were deliberately cut off from the two things that defined most people. Lives in pre-modern societies, family and reproduction. Everyone else married, had children, passed on their name. Eunuchs didn't, they couldn't, which means they had to find different ways to anchor themselves. Some anchored in religion, some in patronage, some in loyalty to their emperor, and some, probably, just drifted along quietly, taking comfort in routines. There's a record from the Ming dynasty of eunuchs forming little brotherhoods. They gave each other surrogate family roles, older brother, younger brother, because they lacked biological kin. In a palace of thousands, they built small, chosen families of their own. That little detail feels deeply human. Let's float to one of the strangest aspects of eunuch life: fashion. Since eunuchs occupied a weird gender category, their clothing often reflected that. In Byzantium, they sometimes wore elaborate silk robes, with bright colors and embroidered designs. Some chroniclers said they looked more like priests than soldiers, more like courtiers than men. In China, eunuchs were often mocked for adopting effeminate styles: perfumes, delicate robes, makeup. Critics accused them of blurring lines. But think about it, if you're already outside the box of masculinity, maybe you just lean into it. Wear the nice silk, smell good. Why not? In the Ottoman harem, eunuchs had strict dress codes. The chief black eunuch wore distinctive robes that set him apart from other palace staff. His very clothing screamed, "I am untouchable, I am powerful, I am different." So in a way, their outfits were armor, a daily costume that turned their outsider status into authority. And then, of course, there were funerals. Eunuchs, lacking heirs, often had to make careful plans for their burials. They left money in wills for tombs, inscriptions, or donations that guaranteed monks or imams would pray for their souls. Some were buried with extraordinary honor. The Byzantine eunuch Joseph Bringas was given a lavish tomb. The Ottoman Bashir Aga built his own endowment that funded Qur'an recitations for centuries after his death. In China, some Ming eunuchs built elaborate mausoleums, almost like mini-imperial tombs. Others, less fortunate, were buried in unmarked graves, forgotten as soon as they were gone. No heirs, no descendants to remember them, just vanished into palace dust. And that contrast between powerful patrons remembered in stone and nameless servants erased overnight is maybe the truest reflection of eunuch life, at once central and disposable, visible and invisible. If you zoom in on these quieter details, the patronage, the friendships, the fashion, the funerals, you start to see eunuchs less as stock characters and more as actual humans. People living strange, constrained lives, but still finding ways to leave traces. Their existence is a little haunting, honestly. Entire populations of men defined by what they lacked, and yet somehow woven so deeply into the fabric of empires that those empires couldn't function without them. They were paradox made flesh, and in their daily lives they leaned into that paradox. Some embraced religion, some embraced art, some embraced power, and some just got through the day. Let's pause for a moment. If you've drifted off, you're dreaming about silk robes and incense. If you're still awake, stretch your shoulders, because we're heading into the final long wanderings soon. So far, we've seen eunuchs rise as explorers, generals, guardians. We've watched them become villains of decline. And now, we've seen glimpses of their private humanity: friendships, fashion, funerals. In the next part, we'll bring it all together. We'll think about eunuchs, not just as oddities, but as a recurring feature of human history. We'll ask, why did so many empires keep creating them, century after century? What does that say about power, trust, and human society? That's where we'll float next. Hey again, if you're still awake, you deserve a medal. If you're already drifting into that cozy half-sleep, where words turn into fuzzy background music, that's fine too. This is exactly the zone we want. Comfortable, a little surreal, and full of bizarre palace details. So, we've looked at eunuchs as explorers, generals, villains, wallpaper, fashionistas, and patrons of monasteries. But now we need to step back, because there's a bigger question floating around behind all of this. Why did so many empires across the world, China, Byzantium, the Ottomans, the Abbasids, keep turning to eunuchs? It wasn't like they all got together at some ancient HR conference and decided, yes, eunuchs are definitely the way to go. Yet century after century, different states came up with the same idea. Take some boys, cut them off literally from dynastic ambitions, and use them as palace insiders. It's one of history's weirdest convergences. The simplest answer is trust. Emperors didn't trust anyone. Not their brothers, not their uncles, not their generals, not their ministers, especially not their sons. But eunuchs. Eunuchs were safe. Think about it. They had no heirs to build dynasties, no sons to inherit power, no brothers-in-law demanding patronage. They were, in theory, politically sterile as well as physically sterile. If you were an emperor constantly worried that everyone wanted your throne, and, let's be honest, they usually did, the eunuchs were the only people you could invite into your bedroom at night without worrying they'd kill you in your sleep. It was a grim kind of loyalty, built on mutilation, but it worked. Another reason: access. Eunuchs were stationed in places where no one else was allowed. In harems, in bedchambers, in ritual spaces. They controlled doors, literally, in palaces, where doorways mattered more than armies. Controlling who could and couldn't see the emperor was the ultimate power move. And emperors, being dramatic, loved that. They wanted gatekeepers who were completely dependent on them. Eunuchs filled that role perfectly. One Byzantine chronicler basically admitted this. Emperors liked eunuchs because they were pliable. No family, no distractions, no armies of their own. Just pure palace creatures. But there's also something deeper: symbolism. In many cultures, eunuchs became walking metaphors of power. They represented the emperor's ability to reshape human bodies, to decide who was whole and who wasn't. Keeping eunuchs was like displaying dominance in flesh. They also blurred categories, neither fully male nor fully female, neither fully inside society nor fully outside it. And that ambiguity made them strangely suited to the liminal spaces of empire. The harem, the throne room, the secret council chamber. They were living borders, human thresholds, always halfway in, halfway out. And societies, as it turns out, loved their thresholds. Of course, all of this came at a cost. Eunuchs often grew powerful precisely because emperors relied on them too much. And then history writers swooped in and turned them into scapegoats. The empire falls, must have been the eunuchs. The dynasty collapses. Those scheming castrates did it. It was too easy. They were already outsiders. So blaming them was convenient. But if you strip away the scapegoating, the pattern is consistent. Empires made eunuchs because they needed them, then hated them because they needed them, then blamed them when things went wrong, and yet made more eunuchs anyway. It's the political version of eating junk food. You know it's bad for you, but you keep reaching for it. And here's something almost poetic. For all their power, eunuchs rarely founded dynasties. They didn't leave family lines. They rarely left legacies outside their patronage of churches or temples. But they left imprints in memory, in chronicles, in gossip, in folk tales. Even now, centuries later, we're still talking about them. Still fascinated by these liminal figures, these half-forgotten courtiers who drifted in and out of history's spotlight. That's a kind of immortality. Not the immortality of bloodlines, but of curiosity. Now, let's look at one last ironic detail. By the 19th century, the age of eunuchs was fading. Western powers pushed against the practice. Medical science finally called it barbaric. New bureaucracies replaced palace rituals. Slowly, the need for eunuchs shrank. China abolished the imperial eunuch system in the early 1900s. The Ottomans phased theirs. Out in the late 1800s, the Byzantine eunuchs had disappeared centuries earlier with the empire itself. The last Chinese eunuch we know of, Sun Yaoting, died in 1996. Yes, you heard that right, 1996. He was born in 1902, castrated as a boy in hopes of serving in the Forbidden City, only to see the empire collapse before he got there. He spent his life in odd jobs, fading into obscurity. By the time he died, the world had airplanes, computers, and pop music. And yet, here was a living remnant of one of history's strangest traditions. The age of eunuchs ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. One old man in a modern hospital bed, carrying the weight of an institution that had shaped empires for 2,000 years. So why did eunuchs keep recurring? Because power is paranoid. Because rulers want servants who can't betray them with heirs. Because access is everything. And because societies sometimes need liminal people, outsiders, who are both useful and expendable. It wasn't about cruelty alone, though there was plenty of that. It was about control. Eunuchs were the human embodiment of control, and that's why they lasted so long. We've reached the end of our long, slow wander. We've drifted through Chinese treasure fleets, Byzantine coups, Ottoman harems, Byzantine monasteries, Ming opera troupes, and all the quiet daily rhythms in between. We've seen eunuchs rise, fall, fade, and linger. And through it all, the strangest part is how familiar they feel. Cut off from family, stuck in service, judged for their appearance, gossiped about by neighbors, blamed for things they didn't do. Strip away the palace silks, and you see people who lived in the margins. trying to carve meaning from lives that weren't entirely their own. That, maybe, is the most human thing of all. Alright, that's enough for tonight. You can close your eyes now. Let the strange, quiet world of eunuchs dissolve into the background hum of your thoughts. And if you dream, maybe you'll dream of a palace corridor, lit by oil lamps, where soft footsteps echo and secrets never quite fade. Good night.